Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our weekly webinar series. This week we're covering Zerto plus eGroup plus Microsoft to really highlight, are you prepared for a disaster? Pertinent to this time we're living in, especially since those of us with eGroup in South Carolina just went through a little tropical storm yesterday that came in off the coast. So good morning, welcome, and we've got a lot to cover in 30 minutes, so let's go ahead and get going. Quick background on eGroup for those that don't know about us yet or are still interested in learning more about us. We've about a 20-year-old company, 3 focus areas: data center infrastructure, cloud services, and managed services. We've been delivering around 2 decades, like I said, successful outcomes for our customers. Really, we deliver speed and certainty in the data center and cloud. Really, our focus is on solutions that make sense, are simple, and really kind of bring home the value of technology. About myself, my name is Mike Dent. I'm the director of data center for eGroup. I've been with eGroup almost 8 years now, a little over 20 years in the IT field, both as a consultant, vendor, customer, you name it. Led a lot of teams. And the team I lead now is the data center team. We're focused really around emerging data center technologies, hybrid cloud, component solutions, and that really blend the on-premise data center with cloud. Quick just fact about me, throw this out there: I love bacon and a good Hawaiian shirt, so it's always a good way to start the day around topics around this. So
hey Mike,
today's conversation.
Can you throw it in presenter mode so it's a little bit bigger for us? Your PowerPoint.
Yes. How about this? Sorry.
Like it.
Good. Okay. So today's conversation, really what we're talking about is using Zerto and Microsoft Azure together to make sure you are prepared for a disaster, to make sure your organization is really built to withstand any potential outcomes that might come through from whether it's a physical disaster or whether it's an internal disaster, right? Data centers go down, power goes out, or ransomware attacks, right? So one of the challenges I was given for this conversation today was to do a live demo. We all know how live demos go. So I was given the challenge to see how many times I could fail a virtual machine over from an on-premise data center to Azure and back within 30 minutes, right? So I'm already 3 minutes into our 30 minutes. I've got 27 minutes left. So let's see how this challenge is going to look like. So I'm going to go ahead and hop into actually a live demo. For those who haven't seen Zerto, don't worry, we're going to come back to it, or are not familiar with how Zerto interacts with Azure, I'm going to swing back to that. But in order to make this challenge work, I've got to start doing some work. So we're going to jump into Zerto. I'm going to show a couple things real quick. One is I've got this tiny VM in VMware. It's just a VM that's running in my on-premise infrastructure. And what I want to do is I want to be able to replicate this VM and fail it over to Azure. From the Azure perspective, so everybody can see on my screen, there is no VM called Tiny VM that lists in the inventory right now, just to prove that I haven't kind of pre-staged some of this stuff. And in Zerto, I have this replication demo protection group that I've been protecting and replicating to Azure. Doesn't matter if it's for the last hour or for the last 2 weeks, I've got a VM unprotected. So again, I'm just going to go ahead and walk through the failover real quick, just to make sure I can satisfy my challenge for this particular webinar. And I'm going to come back to this. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about what I'm actually doing here, but just to prove that I'm actually failing over. So it's starting the failover task. We're going to swing back around to that in a minute. I want to get going through some content here. So with Zerto, right, and whether it's Zerto or any other solution, we have to be prepared for both unplanned and planned outages and scenarios for our business, right? You can see kind of on this slide, kind of highlight the unplanned versus planned, right? So the unplanned is going to be our disaster recovery, infrastructure failures, power outages, natural disaster, ransomware. We're all dealing with these things on a day-to-day basis. Operational recovery, right? We have users. We all support users. Users make errors sometimes, right? We have to deal with that. We have to be able to provide a resilient strategy for getting operations back in order quickly. That long-term retention, which kind of blends both the unplanned and planned, right? Legal requirements. Maybe we have some unexpected issues come up that we have to go back and capture data or provide data from past scenarios or past kind of cases, if a legal law firm, things like that. And compliance, right? So that kind of straddles both the unplanned and planned scenario. And then in our planned outages and planned items, we've got that application mobility and cloud protection and cloud to cloud. How do we be able to provide our applications the ability to move as necessary to be able to do on-prem work, to cloud work, and back and forth? How can I make my applications seamlessly move between environments? And then we have our operational services that also include planned scenarios, right? Migrations and consolidations. If I'm migrating data centers, if I'm consolidating data centers, if I'm acquiring companies, how do I quickly and easily ingest their data, ingest their applications into my environment, without having to spend a lot of capital expense on my on-premise infrastructure potentially. Dev, test, and patch, right? How do we manage those? Do I want all of my dev and test machines living in my on-premise infrastructure, wasting resources potentially? Or can I utilize the cloud environments for this? And then finally, infrastructure modernization. Every 3 to 5, 7 years, right? We're having to do this big lift and shift. We're having to buy new equipment. We're having to do things that basically require large capital expenses, but the cloud can provide me a quick way to mitigate that, to move to more of that operational model and quickly capture my costs that I know I'm going to be living through. With Zerto, and again, with all of our businesses, we have 3 different kind of scenarios that we deal with, right? Our disaster recovery, our backups, our hybrid clouds, our security, the different areas. These are all siloed solutions. We've historically always built our backup to be one product, our disaster recovery to be another, our hybrid cloud might be another. We've struggled with these 3 different scenarios and the fact that we've always had different products, different administrators, different items we had to manage, also introducing different failure points. But the point here with Zerto, coupled with Microsoft Azure, is it provides us a simplified platform with all these capabilities, right? I can ingest all of my different scenarios and different silos into a consolidated product and a consolidated platform that provide both the orchestration and automation I need to be able to handle this across each of these silos, but also the continuous data protection, knowing I'm getting replicated data, knowing I have the potential for failing back should I have a ransomware attack quickly and easily to a certain point in time, and then the flexibility across multiple platforms. With Zerto, specifically, we have the major hypervisor support, right? VMware, Hyper-V. We have the major cloud support with Azure, AWS, IBM. And we have hardware, and we're hardware agnostic. It doesn't matter what hardware we're running this on, or to some extent, even what hypervisor we're running it on. I'm going to back out of here real quick, and let's check on our live demo. So, just to kind of show in Azure now, if I do a refresh of my screen, I have TinyVM that showed up. So my VM is now replicated and running within my Azure environment. If I wanted to click on him, I can. I get an IP address that's within my Azure tenant, within my Azure network. And if I go back and look at my on-prem VMware environment, TinyVM still shows up. So I want to be able to clean that up. I'm going to commit my failover. In doing so, I'm reversing my protection and bringing my data back on-prem. I'm not failing back on-prem yet, but I'm just making sure that my Azure VM, whatever happens there, is being replicated back on to my on-premise infrastructure. So when I'm ready to fail back at the end of this webinar, I'll be able to. And we'll see here in a minute, I'm not going to keep this up, but TinyVM will be removed from my inventory here. Let's get back to the slide deck. So again, Zerto provides that capacity across all of our silos to basically simplify the platform that we're using for replication, to some extent backups, and the hybrid cloud migration. So a little bit about Microsoft Azure and why we at eGroup really love it, and we have really kind of launched 100% in with it, right? It's instantly expanding your IT capabilities, right? If I bring on that new company, if I bring on a new group, if I bring on new applications, I don't necessarily have to believe that I have to buy new infrastructure just to be able to handle this if I have the capabilities to burst to a cloud, right? The cloud, as I see on the right side of that screen, it's ideal when you need to get things up and running fast or scale instantly, right? We have a lot of conversations around VDI with customers where I'm starting to hit my limits of what I can do on-prem with VDI. Well, let's make sure your VDI solution can quickly scale into Azure, can quickly burst when I need it to. paying for only what I need to use, right? So that gives me the ability to really hone in on my test and dev environments to simplify what those groups are using, instead of just giving them, hey, just go run some VMs, no cost associated with you, free and clear. Now all of a sudden I can understand what my organization is doing and get a very good cost model. So again, choose the combination that's right for you. With Zerto and Azure, I have my on-premise infrastructure, I have my cloud infrastructure, and I can quickly and easily blend those two together. So let's jump into some Zerto architecture examples. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Zerto, this will kind of help you understand what I just went through from the beginning of the demo. Is our traditional environment is an on-premise environment. So we have 2 different data centers, might be more than 2 data centers. But with each environment with Zerto, we've got the Zerto management components, which are highlighted there in red in each data center. The Zerto virtual manager and our virtual replication appliances. The vDisk is the content of the VMs. And what we're doing is we're getting a continuous stream capture. A lot of replication technologies use snapshots. They take a snapshot at certain times, 5, 10 minutes, an hour. They replicate that snapshot, and my failover or my recovery is the point of that last snapshot. I don't have that continuous stream. What Zerto is doing is Zerto is injecting itself into the I/O of the VMware hosts and basically capturing every write opportunity or write I/O that happens to that VM. No impact to the VM. So it's basically giving me a stream of all occurring activity of that VM. And I take that stream and I send it to the other side. So I've got a mirror on my other side. So really with Zerto, I can get down to an 8-second or less window of data moving across my wire, right? So instead of having a 5, 10, 15-minute snapshot or an hour snapshot, now I'm down to seconds of data being replicated from one side to another. So that's our traditional on-premise Zerto environment. This could be 1, it could be 2, it could be N+1, right? We can have multiple. If I have multiple business continuity or disaster recovery sites, Zerto can replicate 1 to many or many to 1. With Azure, it looks a little bit different, right? So now I don't have full control over the Azure kind of the world. So what we've done is we've simplified. One thing I didn't talk about on the data center side is when I set up Zerto, I've got a VRA, which is our virtual replication appliance. I've got 1 per VMware host I've got in my environment. It's a small Linux VM, no low resources, no storage requirement. If I've got 3 hosts, I've got 3 VRAs. If I've got 20 hosts, I've got 20 VRAs. And those live directly on the hosts themselves and are pinned to the host, and that's what provides our replication. When we go to Azure, though, it's a little different, right? We don't have host level awareness. So what Zerto has done is they've taken that ZVM, the Zerto Virtual Manager, and the VRA, and collapsed it into the Zerto Cloud Appliance. And in previous versions, earlier versions of Zerto, we had to scale our environment in Azure based on how many VMs we were replicating, and then accommodate more ZCAs, more of the Zerto Cloud Appliances, right? So now we had to direct our protection to 1 or more. It's kind of poor man's load balancing, right? I need these 5 protection groups to go to 1 ZCA, these 5 to go to another, and so forth. This is a Windows VM, standard Windows VM that we deploy into Azure. And it's, again, everything is in this 1 ZCA, right? So this provides us the replication peering. So the communication is from my ZVM on-prem to my ZCA in the cloud. And a lot of acronyms here, a lot of Zs, but they talk to each other, and that's where the replication occurs. Earlier versions of Zerto, this was kind of a struggle, right, to be able to scale quickly, because now I had to stand up more ZCAs and so forth as my environment grew. With the newer versions of Zerto, specifically 7.0 and above, they introduced the scale-out architecture that Azure provides with scale sets. And scale sets is basically the capability to say, I have a scale set of a specific type of VM, and I want to be able to scale that up and down based on some sort of workload requirement, some sort of item, whether it's CPU, whether it's bandwidth, whether it's I/O, whether it's any sort of kind of determination that I need to say, I need more resources. So what Zerto did is, instead of having to have multiple ZCAs, they worked with Microsoft to say, how can we use your cloud scalable technology to make our product better? So what they did with the later versions of Zerto is introduce the ability to have kind of a queue process from a worker model. So I need to do a bunch of work, it sits in this queue, And then I spin up a bunch of little VMs in this scale set. And these VMs are, one CPU, 1 or 2 gigs of memory, and I'll spin up 10 or 11 of them or more, up to 41 to be exact, to handle the replication and failover operations for Zerto. So instead of needing multiple ZCAs, I've been able to really lower my RTO and recovery window by being able to use this scale out, this Azure scale set, which dynamically scales out the VMs and will shrink them back down based on the operations that are going. So again, we got a lot less overhead because now I don't have to manage multiple Windows VMs in Azure, multiple ZCAs, but I can use the technology built into Azure to be able to quickly scale my environment as needed, right? So it's a much simpler operation. So let's talk about the VM protection with Azure. So how does it, with Zerto and Azure, how does it work, right? The concept with Zerto is I protect a VM or multiple VMs into a virtual protection group, a VPG. This grouping is typically logically done not by data store, but by logical grouping of VMs. We can go back to the old kind of grouping mentality that everybody uses. I've got a SQL server, I've got an app server, and I've got a web server. Those logically go together. And the benefit there is the fact that I'm protecting them together. I'm not taking a snapshot of one VM at 11 o'clock, a snapshot of another VM at 11:15, and a snapshot of another VM at 11:30. They're all being protected together, which means when I fail over, they're all going to be replicated and come up consistently as they were together. So now I don't have different SLAs for different VMs or for different products. There is no performance impact to have one or more VMs within a VPG. Some customers want one VM per VPG because that's the way their applications are laid out. Some prefer to have one VM exist in multiple VPGs, and I'll touch on why you do that in a minute. And some prefer to have multiple VMs inside a single VPG. Fully customizable based on the applications and the workloads. So again, application consistency grouping. I'm going to go ahead and build this out. What I touched on just a minute ago, instead of having the different snapshot time for the different scenarios, right? Even if I take a snapshot at 12 o'clock and then at 12:01 I get another snapshot, my applications potentially are out of date a little bit from a data perspective. So with application consistency grouping, my VPGs are now streamed consistently together. So I have continuous data replication with those VMs that they all flow together. So you can see on the screen here, I have 5-second snapshots, or not snapshots, excuse me, but checkpoints. So every 5 seconds, I'm sending data to my other side, and I get a checkpoint that says, here's my rollback point, here's my rollback point, here's my rollback point. So you think in a ransomware scenario, with these checkpoints, I've now got the capability to roll back to a very specific point in time for not just one VM backup at a time or one snapshot, but for the entire group of VMs, for the entire grouping of protection groups, right? So in the case that I get hit with ransomware in this slide that I'm showing now, at 2:49, I can now fail over back to any of these previous checkpoints. Think of a TiVo, right? I'm streaming the data in, I can roll back to wherever I want, or a DVR, right? I can stream it, I can roll back to exactly a certain point in time that I want to. This allows me to rewind those VMs to an exact point in time prior to a ransomware attack. Great capability to be able to make sure that all of my VMs are consistently protected. So effective cloud utilization, right? Zerto with Azure gives me the ability to keep different scenarios of time restraints on VMs, right? So in my protected site, I might want to keep a protection group with only, say, maybe 24 hours of potential failback, right? Which means somewhere in that 24-hour window in my journal, I can fail back. But if I want to have a longer retention window for that same protection group or for that VM, I can now basically replicate from my two data centers and say, I want to keep 24 hours between my two data centers, but I need more if I go to the cloud, right? If I want to be able to retain more, and I'm going to keep 1 month of this VM in the cloud. That allows me to fail over anywhere within 24 hours to my local data centers or anywhere previous to the cloud. So it's efficient because we're not paying for running resources in the cloud. We're only paying to store the journal data to be able to fail over to a very specific point in time. So again, it doubles up our capabilities here in the fact that I now have 2 protected sites plus the cloud as an opportunity to be my failover scenarios. So this also allows me to recover certain VMs in my protection groups to the cloud or on-prem. I've got the ability to either recover the entire, or fail over the entire consistent group, the entire VPG, or individual VMs from that. And a good scenario, right, be, like I have on the screen here, maybe the web servers are fine, but the database is not, and I need to fail over the database for recovery, or certain scenarios of the app. A lot of times I see this used for test and dev, where they just want to move test over, keep dev back, or move certain components of a solution to the other site for kind of just keep separation of duties, right? I want half my environment in one site, half my environment in the other side. This allows me to do failover both ways. So now I've got the ability to be very systematic in how I fail over, rather than just being kind of say, I've got to fail over and moving everything. I can now get very granular to the content that I am going to fail over. So we're going to go into the fail back portion now. So make sure I can get this done in my 30-minute window. So again, TinyVM is gone from my on-premise infrastructure. It's now been removed, right? So this VM is now fully running within my Azure environment. We can just prove that again by making sure he's out here, he's good, everything's going. I will now fail him back. So on my screen with Zerto, you'll see I have 3 protection groups, right? One is my replication demo, and then I have 2 other protection groups. That's a SQL server that's protecting 1 VM, and a web server that's protecting 3 VMs. Those are being protected right now from my on-prem infrastructure up to Azure. So we can see on here, I have SQL 01, Web 01, 2, and 3. Those are my other protection groups. So if I wanted to fail them up to Azure and fail them back, I can do that. Let's go ahead and fail TinyVM back from Azure back to my on-prem. So it's as simple as doing another failover. I'm going to make sure that my replication demo is selected. Go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and reverse protect, because I'm just going to make the assumption that when I bring this guy back, I want to go ahead and send him back, replicate back up to Azure as needed, and start the failover. This process will take a couple minutes. As we see on the vCenter side, stuff's already occurring, right? We're already starting to bring data online in my local on-prem environment as my TinyVM in Azure is stopped and being deallocated, right? So I can see that Zerto is handling the failover. It's synchronizing all the data as the VM was shut down, bringing it back on-prem. This is a simplified approach, right? But the interesting thing with this is at the same time I'm failing back, I want to go ahead and fail my other 2 VPGs back up to Azure, right? I want to basically, I'm crisscrossing my replication, and I'm also crisscrossing my failovers right now, right? So I'm moving to and from. So now I'm bringing 1 protection group back from Azure, and I'm sending 4 VMs up to Azure. So within Zerto, I can make this happen. So I'm replicating in both directions. I'm replicating from one site to Azure. This could have been one site to another data center and one site to Azure, in any combination. You can replicate a protection group up to 3 different locations at any given time. So what we see here is that you'll see the SQL server and the web servers, they're shut down as that process begins. So again, Zerto shuts the machines down cleanly, synchronizes all data changes to those VMs, and then brings them up on the alternate side. As we see in Azure here, I'm going through the deallocating process. If you're familiar with what Azure does with VMs, it doesn't just stop the VM, it deallocates the VM, so you're not charged for resources that are not running. So Zerto correctly works with Azure from an API perspective to make sure that when I am failing back out of Azure, I don't leave any resources behind in Azure that I'm going to get charged for. So again, paying for only what I need to use from a cloud perspective. So SQL servers are almost done. Web servers are going up. When we talk about replication and the time frame that it takes, it's all kind of a loaded question, right? It's a loaded question based on how much data are we replicating, how much change rate is there to that data. But realistically, honestly, doing a 30-minute kind of fail up and fail back is not going to be realistic for everybody. It's not going to be realistic for an organization to do this. This is a great little kind of show here, but it's not going to be practical because you're not going to fail up and immediately try to fail back. It's just not going to be practical. But it does show that the product can handle that and do that. So again, what we'll see here is, again, we'll see in a minute, TinyVM is going to show up. And then eventually my SQL Server VMs and web server VMs will go down. So swinging back to the slide deck, that was the last slide, but I wanted to kind of go back and touch on the Azure with Zerto. So one thing here is that Zerto also provides Azure to Azure peering as well. I can replicate from one Azure region to another Azure region if I wanted to. Why would you do that when you could use just the standard Microsoft built-in utilities? You could, right? However, Zerto also provides you the ability to go on-prem to Azure, Azure to Azure, or even in some scenarios, Azure to AWS or AWS into Azure. So we use Zerto a lot to get workloads migrated from on-prem into Azure or other clouds into Azure. So it's a very powerful utility to be able to take VMs across hypervisor, across the different hypervisor platform, and replicate. And one thing I neglected to touch on earlier, from a Zerto perspective, it is not storage aware. It doesn't care what storage you're running. So a lot of replication software, things like SRM with recover point or SRM with a native array replication, requires us to have mirrored environments on both sides, from the array and on both primary and in DR. Zerto, we don't care. Zerto is a software layer replication. So I could have a hyper-converged platform with Nutanix in my primary environment, and I could have a 3-tier environment with some Cisco servers and a pure storage array in my DR environment. And Zerto can replicate between those two environments. It does not matter. So again, storage agnostic, which is one of the great features of Zerto, but because it is a software-based replication, gives us the flexibility from on-prem as well as cloud. Now, TinyVM is now showing up in my on-prem infrastructure. I'm going to go ahead and complete my failovers for my SQL and web servers. And with 2 minutes remaining, I should see my TinyVM start to power back on, proving that within 30 minutes, you can fail out of an on-premise data center, up to Azure, and back. So hopefully this kind of shows you the power of Zerto, not just from an on-prem capability, but from a cloud capability as well, being able to migrate workloads, whether that's moving workloads from a lift and shift, I'm moving my workloads to Azure, or whether that's replicating from my on-prem environment to Azure and back from a disaster recovery or business continuity perspective, right? I have the ability to make sure that my workloads on-prem are being protected into a cloud, but the same works that if I have Azure-based VMs. If I was to build a VM in Azure natively, I can use Zerto to protect that back on-prem, right? So just because I build the VM in Azure doesn't mean it has to stay in Azure all the time. I can use Zerto to fail back or to fail my VMs that I've natively created in Azure back to an on-premise environment. So as you see a bunch of stuff happening on the screen, my TinyVM is powering up. It's got an IP address back on my on-premise environment. And just to prove that it came back, I've got a login screen for my TinyVM. So thank you for joining me this morning. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the week. And
Okay,
if you haven't,
we had a couple of questions come in.
Oh, did we? I didn't have my questions up. Let's go.
Yeah, so the first one is, I know we're running out of time, so if we don't get to anyone's question and they need to jump off, we'll absolutely share the recording of this out later, but we will answer the questions really quickly. The first one is, we have a very high IO intensive database engine. Will Zerto impact the performance while replicating?
No, it will not. So that's a great question, especially on SQL, SQL or even Oracle for that matter. A couple things that we do with Zerto, and I'll try to make this brief, and we can, if you're interested, I'm happy to kind of delve into this after the fact. Zerto, because it does not sit inside the VM, it also doesn't impact the vSphere IO, right? It's listening to anything that comes in. So it's not actually stopping or injecting anything into the workload stream. It's just capturing everything as it goes by. So there's no impact to running VMs. With database platforms, there are a couple tweaks we need to make specifically for Zerto to make failovers better, but those are specifically around the temp database, where those live, and things like that. But it's a great question, and to be honest, we've not seen Zerto have any impact, any noticeable impact on any high-performing, whether it's SQL or even some SAP applications. We've not seen Zerto have any noticeable impact against users or anything like that.
All right, and the next question is, if our company has an express route for Azure, does Zerto take advantage of this pipe?
Absolutely, it does. Because Zerto we're not communicating from on-prem Zerto to our Azure Zerto via the public networks of Azure. We're not using the public, Azure Blob or whatever some of the Azure public addresses are. If you're doing things like Rubric, for example, Rubric replication to Azure, that does use the public Azure side. So that would not use express route, but because this is a VM that lives in our tenant in Azure, all your express route routing would take place for Zerto replication to and from Azure.
All right, and the next question is, what advantage does Zerto give over vanilla Azure Site Recovery if we are already replicating VMs to Azure?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? So Azure Site Recovery is a little less granular. I mean, it's more of a snapshot based. It's a time replication thing, right? So it doesn't have that stream of failover capabilities. So my last snapshot or my last capabilities is going to be the best as my last kind of replication up to Azure with Site Recovery Manager. With Zerto, though, because it's that constant stream, I use the ransomware example kind of as the best case scenario there, is if I needed to fail back to a very specific time, not just my last snapshot or not just my last kind of replicated catalog, I can go to a very specific point in time. So on one of those screens, let me just go ahead and pull my slide deck up here real quick. On this screen, for example, I've now got multiple checkpoints. So this does a couple things for me. It allows me to fail over to a very specific checkpoint. It also allows me to do test failovers with applications to a very specific checkpoint prior to or post upgrading an application, for example. I can now be very granular as to when I fail over, when I fail back. The other thing I didn't touch on in Zerto that's a very powerful feature is file level restores. So we have a little bit of backup capabilities with Zerto as well, and the fact that I can go in and say a user deleted a file from a replicated VM, I have the ability to restore that specific file out of a Zerto journaled replication, similar to how I would do this with a backup, right? But if I don't have to go to my backup software, I can stay within the Zerto environment. So they're Zerto and SRM. It's Azure Site Recovery Manager. Excuse me. They're very similar. However, Zerto has a little bit more power in the replication granularity and from where I can and can't replicate to, right? So I can go Zerto to a data center plus Zerto to Azure and give myself that capability. So a little bit more flexible than Azure Site Recovery Manager would be.
All right, and last but not least, but potentially the most exciting for you to answer is, where do you get a good Hawaiian shirt?
Loaded question. I always hope somebody's going to ask me that question. So a couple fun ones, right? If you go to tipsyelves.com, they have some fun Hawaiian shirts, right? But I've been fortunate enough to go out to Hawaii a couple times over the last year and a half for work. So I've been able to get myself some real good, authentic Hawaiian shirts. But I tell you what, Tipsy Elves, Shinesty, I think is another one. They've got some fun Hawaiian shirts. Some of them are that polyester kind of crappy material that makes you really sweat in the summertime. But if you can get a good one, hey, there's nothing better than a good Hawaiian shirt on a weekend or a Thursday, to be frank. What other questions? Anybody else? Okay, that's it. Well, again, thank you all for joining us this morning. And as I said, Zerto, very powerful utility. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Hope you have a great rest of the day, good rest of the week.